Good morning. My name is Steve Balls. I serve as the 8th president of Augustana College. It is great to see so many former students and colleagues honor Dorothy Parkander. Dorothy Parkander, what a great faculty member, great person, and pillar of the Augustana College community. I'm fond of asking alums, when I meet alums, who do you remember at Augustana? Who made a difference in your life? The two most common answers for a generation of students and graduates are two women, Betsy Brodall and Dorothy Parkander. When I learned that Dorothy had passed, I decided to read an essay that she had put together fairly recently, well, I guess 16 years ago, in honor of Tom Treadway upon his retirement. A beautifully written essay, as you know. But what struck me from that essay is that Dorothy Parkander loved learning for the sake of learning. She believed in learning for an active life of the mind. Students, so often we connect learning to outcomes. The modern president is always asking, what are the outcomes that we expect? But may we pause and understand that learning creates an active life of the mind. And it is the active life of the mind that we should most value at Augustana College. I had an opportunity earlier this week to talk to one of Dorothy's former students about her. She gave me some insight on Dorothy that I had not known before. She talked about coming into Dorothy's classroom. It was this graduate's perception that Dorothy was a bit shy. Sometimes she would stand at the back of the classroom. This student said, I was very shy, like Dorothy. And for the next hour, during Dorothy's lectures, she drew me out of my shell. I became alive in the world of Chaucer and others. And when the lecture ended, I went back into my shell, but a little less shy and a little more alive. Today, we honor a great woman.
Let us pray. Be praised, O God, for this gilded morning. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the word gild means to cover thinly with gold. So then again, be praised, O God, for this gilded morning, gold the dawn of the eastern sky, and gold the dawn inside us, this new day. Be praised, O God, for mirth that longs for and gives expression in music. Again, the OED finds synonyms for mirth in merriment, hilarity, high spirits, and euphoria. Be praised, O God, for all that in us. And be praised, O God, for the life that lives in words well imagined and elegantly expressed, as by Homer, Chaucer, Milton, and others, and by your servant, our friend and teacher, Dorothy Parkander. Be praised, O God, for Dorothy on this day of remembrance, as she honored the original word, big W, in all that she did. So may we in this remembrance also give you honor and praise. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated.
Dorothy's lectures on the Odyssey have acquired imperishable fame, as Homer would say. Like an inspired bard, she entranced thousands with her winged words. I will therefore not presume to read from the Odyssey. Instead, when Dr. Bowden and Pastor Prigge asked me to read from Homer, a passage from the Iliad came to mind. Achilles has, by Iliad Book 18, realized a transcendent insight about human volition and responsibility and mortality, one to which no one else in the epic has a clue. For Achilles to enact this insight, to teach it to the future, will mean self-sacrifice. The enactment will be a form of battle, but what armor does one carry into a battle of transcendent values? Metaphorical, of course. Even the transcendent will need a shield, and Homer provides one. To our surprise, it is the whole round world. That is why this passage came to me as I thought about Dorothy's work, or at least the portion I was privileged to meet. In her mind and heart, she carried a world. In Homer, the shield is forged by the blacksmith god of Olympus, Hephaestus, for just one mortal. But Dorothy forged a shield for us all. Hers was astonishingly capacious. Thus, I see some world-encompassing analogy in one of her poets, Homer. I will read a few excerpts. First of all, he forged Hephaestus a shield that was huge and heavy, elaborating it about and threw around it a shining triple rim that glittered, and the shield strap was cast of silver. There were 5 folds composing the shield itself, and upon it he elaborated many things in his skill and craft. He made the earth upon it, and the sky, and the sea's water, and the tireless sun, and the moon waxing into her fullness, and on it all the constellations that festoon the heavens, the Pleiades and the Hyades and the strength of Orion, and the bear, whom the men also give the name of the wagon. On it he wrought in all their beauty 2 cities of mortals, and there were marriages won, and festivals, and they were leading the brides along the city from their chambers under the flaring of torches, and the loud bride song was arising. The young men followed the circles of the dance. But around the other city were lying 2 forces of armed men, shining in their war gear. For one side, counsel was divided whether to storm and sack, or share between both sides the property and all the possessions that the lovely citadel held hard within it. But the city's people were not giving way, and armed for an ambush. Their beloved wives and the little children stood on the rampart to hold it, and with them the men with age upon them. But meanwhile the others went out, and Ares led them, and Pallas Athena. And the renowned smith of the strong arms made elaborate on it a dancing floor, like that which once in the wide spaces of Knossos Daedalus built for Ariadne of the lovely tresses. And there were young men on it, and young girls sought for their beauty with gifts of oxen, dancing and holding hands at the wrist. These wore the maidens long light robes, and the men wore tunics of fine spun work, and shining softly touched with olive oil. And the girls wore fair garlands on their heads, while the young men carried golden knives that hung from sword belts of silver. At whiles on their understanding feet they would run very lightly, and around the lovely chorus of dancers stood a great multitude, happily watching. Thereafter, when the renowned smith of the strong arms had finished the armor, he lifted it and laid it before the mother of Achilles, and she, like a hawk, came sweeping down from the snows of Olympus and carried with her the shining armor, the gift of Hephaestus. Thank you for your metaphorical world, Homer, and thank you, Dorothy, for the gift of yours, so imperishably tangible.
This morning's readings are chosen by the several of us mostly because they're inevitable choices. You know, they're some of the works, some of the authors that were closest to Dorothy's heart and closest to her teaching. So on a morning like this, when we're celebrating Dorothy's teaching at Augustana, somebody ought to read Chaucer. It's going to be me. One of the words I heard most often at her funeral last Monday was the word pilgrimage. It's an appropriate word for any Christian's life, lots of other people's lives too. The reason it came up so often at Dorothy's funeral, of course, was because her pilgrimage is just now over. Chaucer's principal work, the Canterbury Tales, is of course about a pilgrimage. So I'll read the opening of it, which sort of announces the pilgrimage, which is happening just 6 months opposite the season we're in now, you know, early, mid-April. I'm reading it in Middle English. Some of you will be fine with that. Some of you will just have to wait till I'm done. But I mean, we call it Middle English in sort of retrospect. It was English then, it's not so different from modern English that if you listen with a kind of flexibility that you would, you know, afford to say Pig Latin or something like that, you know, and just stand back a little bit, you'll hear, you know, pretty much the same, something almost like a translation forming in your mind. One that April with her sure sota, the drucht of March hath perished to the rota, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which thereto engendered is the flour. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every halt and hath. The tender croppus and the youngest son hath in the ram his how the course he run. And smalle fools maken melodia that slepen all the night with open ear, so breaketh him natuur in her courages. Then longen folk to gaan on pilgrimages, and palmers for to zeeken strange strandes, to ferne always couth in sundry lands. And specially from every sheerest end of England to Canterbury they went, the holy blissful martyr, for to sake that him hath holpen one that they were sake. Befell that in that season on a day, in Southwark at the tabard as he lie, ready to wenden on me pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage. At night was come into that hostelria, well 29 in a compania of sundry folk be aventuri falla, in fellowship, and the pilgrims were they all. I decided to interject a small poem in today's readings too, a poem called The Pulley by George Herbert. Not quite as old as the Canterbury Tales, but a pretty old poem. It's called The Pulley, and one of the mysteries for a first acquaintance with the pulley is that there's no evident pulley in the poem. So in some modernizing anthologies, it's called, appropriately enough, The Gifts of God. I'm only going to read it once. It's new to most of the rest of you, so I'll say just a word or two that might help you make your way through it without terrible trouble. It sort of imagines the last active day of creation when God is, in fact, making humanity, making Adam and Eve, and it's as if we sort of, you know, overhear what he's thinking, you know, deciding what gifts to give to God, to give to man, and what gift to withhold, although maybe the withholding is also a kind of gift. The gift of God or the pulley. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure, rest at the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. I picked that poem because Dorothy gave a kind of meditation on it not more than about 10 years ago at St. John's Lutheran Church, so I know it was a poem close to her heart.
So to continue with the theme of pilgrimage, in 1985, the 125th year of its existence, Augustana College sponsored 7 sermons through the year to mark that anniversary, later published by the Augustana Historical Society, and Kai Swanson assures me it's either in print or on the digital commons, right, Kai, or both. One of the 7 sermons that year, as you might well imagine, was preached by Dorothy Parkander on the festival of the Ascension of our Lord, May 12th, 1985. In addition to the story of Jesus' ascension, Dorothy chose Psalm 84, which we are now to read aloud, as a jumping-off point for her sermon. It is a pilgrimage psalm, otherwise called a psalm of ascent, going up. The passionate journey of the pilgrim to the temple on Mount Zion, described in Psalm 84, mirrors the tales of Homer, Milton, Dante, Chaucer, all of which are stories of pilgrimage. The psalm and all these pilgrimage stories trace the journey of the human soul, really. As Anne Bowden has written about Dorothy, quote, she adopted the metaphor of the journey before it entered popular culture. The meaning is in the questions rather than in the answers, she would tell students. The meaning is in the questions and in the journey itself. What questions persist in you today? What journey are you on this morning as we draw close to Dorothy and her example? We recite Psalm 84 responsively with you reading the parts in the bold print. How dear to me is your dwelling, O Lord of hosts.
My soul hath desired and longing for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh rejoice in the living God.
Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest where she may lay her young, by the side of your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God.
Happy are they who dwell in your house. They will always be praising you.
Happy are the people whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on the pilgrim's way.
Those who go down the awesome valley will find a place of streams, with the river beneath and covered it with pools of water.
They will climb from height to height, and the God of gods will be seen in Zion.
Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God, my Savior.
Behold our defender, O God, and look upon the face of your anointed.
For one day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked.
For the Lord God is both sun and shield, bestowing grace and glory. No good thing will the Lord withhold from those who walk with integrity. In reading the following fragment from Adam's speech near the very end of Paradise Lost by John Milton, I'm filling in for Jason Peters, who is the current and third occupant of the Dorothy Parkander Chair in Literature. Jason chose this particular speech as one that he feels is especially appropriate to Dorothy and very much wanted to be present to read it himself. However, he has a long-standing family commitment today that he could neither change nor miss. And so you have decidedly the second string filling in for Jason this morning. I was privileged to take world literature from Dorothy the spring of my freshman year at Augustana, and having enjoyed it greatly, I wanted to take another Parkander course my senior year. I don't recall caring particularly about Milton when I signed up for the course. Parkander was the one I wanted, not Milton. But you will remember that Milton's purpose in writing his epic poem, Paradise Lost, was, quote, to justify God's ways to men. And so at the end, Adam has a chance to summarize his learnings from the whole Adam and Eve and the serpent in the garden episode. So what follows now is Adam speaking in the words of John Milton, Paradise Lost, Book 12. Henceforth I learn that to obey is best, and love with fear the only God, to walk as in his presence, ever to observe his providence, and on him soul depend. Merciful over all his works, with good still overcoming evil, and by small accomplishing great things, by things deemed weak subverting worldly strong and worldly wise, by simply meek, that suffering for truth's sake is fortitude to highest victory, and to the faithful death the gate of life. Taught this by his example, whom I now acknowledge my Redeemer, ever blessed. So even Adam's fall is fortunate, you might say, as it gives God a chance to behave in keeping with God's deepest nature, which is to forgive and to open the way into a hopeful future. And as Jason Peters told me, I especially like, quote, by small accomplishing great things, as a description of a life of teaching, said Jason. We listen to the choir sing.
And
I'm honored to speak to you about Dr. Dorothy Parkander. Dr. Parkander was, for over half a century, my teacher, mentor, and dear friend. And she was my lens for seeing what most shaped Augustana and so many students during their college years and in their lives beyond. I have to begin with the smile. Everyone who remembers Dr. Parkander remembers her smile. Mile-wide, energetic, authentic, joy-filled. It lighted a room, a day, for some of us, a lifetime. Many of us associate her with light, the sparkle in her eyes, the glow in her voice, the passion of her reading, and what her colleague Roll Tweet has called her deep, indecorous laughter. She radiated light and delight. Both students and colleagues were illuminated by her sense of what education could do, should do. College should be a place to explore new ideas deeply, thoughtfully. What is a hero? Should study of Homer be left only to classics and English majors? Are Milton's 17th century ideas about censorship applicable to today's politics? What can Jane Austen teach us about love and sacrifice? But people who remember Dr. Parkander speak also of maybe meeting her striding across campus on a chilly Monday that would be brightened by her hearty, "Good morning." Neighbors recall seeing the light from her kitchen window, a reassuring sign that she was in residence and probably baking something that had a good chance of coming their way. I myself, like many students, remember sitting in her living room and watching the bright flames in her fireplace, her small, strong hands ash-stained from building that fire, talking and talking about books, writers, the word, sacred and secular, the life of the spirit, the play of the mind, the things of light. To speak of Dorothy Parkander, then, is inevitably to recognize a light motif. And so it seems to me fitting, as we remember her presence at Augustana today, to explore the ways in which she brought light to us. She began her teaching career at Augustana in 1947, when she was just 22. Not a time when it was particularly easy to be a light bearer. The influx of students enrolled on the post-war GI Bill meant jammed classes, offices in closets, literally, and overwhelming teaching loads. She would face as many as 90 weekly essays from first-year writing classes. So in those days, a good night's sleep would mean maybe 4 or 5 hours. Under these circumstances, the most brilliant spirits could dim, but hers rarely did. When she recalled these years, she said they were good ones. I was teaching at Augustana, where I was honored to be. My students were men older than I, most of whom had experienced far more of the dark side of life than I had. And because of that, they knew exactly why they were in college. I was doing what I had always wanted to do, always felt called to do. It was a privilege to give what I could to these students. Well, to most of them. There was the famous incident of the lone young high school graduate who turned in some scrawled gibberish on an assignment he assumed she wouldn't read. When she expressed to the class her disappointment in that response, without, of course, identifying the student, a hefty ex-Marine stood up and demanded, "All right, who did it?" A blush gave the kid away. The Marine then turned and said gently, "All right, Miss Parkander, you can leave the room. I'll handle this." The high schoolers' assignments from then on were, if not inspired, at least honestly completed. What those returning veterans saw was no untested optimism that would falsify their grim experience, but a young instructor who could balance idealism and irony. Perhaps it was her upbringing in a busy parsonage that gave her that wisdom, gave her unflagging energy for life, and a hope for and belief in a splendor that was sometimes realized. To her surprise, and sometimes to her consternation, for her humility was as great as her reputation, and yes, President Ball, she was shy. That vision soon made her a force on campus. Students began enrolling in her classes in nearly unprecedented numbers. They quickly learned that if you wanted to take a Parkander course, you'd be advised to sign up early. Some of them would get up before dawn, undergraduates, to be first in the registration line as soon as it opened. In 1981, as she was completing 34 years at the college, an Observer article named her one of Augustana's 12 most powerful people. Not because she held positions on important committees. Actually, she hated and avoided committee work. But because, as the article stated, when people were asked to name someone who helped form opinions at Augustana, her name was almost always mentioned. For many students and some faculty in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Dorothy Parkander was Augustana College. And by the 80s, students, as Pastor Prigge has said, would sign up for a Parkander course. It didn't really matter which, as long as you could get in. One student from that period asserted, half seriously, that nobody should be allowed to graduate without taking a Parkander course. Her many honors, the majority of them firsts: first occupant of the Conrad Bergendorf Chair in the Humanities, first woman to have a chair named for her, first recipient of the Illinois Professor of the Year Award. These honors echo that assessment, as does a comment from the late noted Lutheran theologian, Dr. Joseph Sittler. Dorothy Parkander, he said, represents in herself and in her teaching all that we mean by the liberal arts. But it's not always easy being a light bearer. You have to push against darkness continually and determinedly. When she first returned to teach at her beloved alma mater, the world at large contained some dark corners, and Augustana wasn't altogether immune from them. There was gender inequity, salary discrimination, preconceptions about women's roles. For a time, young Professor Parkander was actually expected to help with the housework in some campus facilities. And these inequities existed despite the towering presence of her professor and mentor, the redoubtable Dr. Henriette C. K. Naiseth. This was a time when, at Augustana, diversity meant Norwegian or Catholic, both to be wary of, if not outright feared. It was a time when most of the faces you saw across campus were white, and Augustana's religious tradition could too often translate to rigid moral prescriptions. Dorothy Parkander brought light to these places, not by a flame of anger, but simply by bearing the light of her dedication, her academic excellence, her care and concern for all students, her open-handed, open-hearted hospitality, her perception of a love larger than whether or not God would frown on social dancing. For her, celebrating diversity and practicing inclusivity weren't rhetorical concepts. They were the vision she lived. Yet in later years, when people remarked that she had been ahead of her time, she was surprised. Wasn't hospitality an enduring virtue, both classical and Christian? I never did anything radical, she claimed. I didn't think about it. I just did the thing I loved for the students I loved. And part of that loving was listening. She listened with the ear of her heart, as St. Benedict puts it, graciously, gravely, playfully. Many students of both genders, but especially women, said that Dr. Parkander was the first person who had taken them seriously, had encouraged and enabled, even helped shape their dreams. One gifted African-American alumnus sent her a card every Mother's Day until his untimely death, because she had given him the gift of seeing his vocation. What Augustana today strives to be, and when it succeeds in being that, it walks in light Dorothy Parkander has shed. The dark areas that her light touched weren't only institutional. There are many personal stories and many students who have told them. There were the returning Korean War veterans, victims of an unpopular conflict, their service and sacrifice ignored. They'd appear at her door in the early hours of their sleepless nights and talk about the anger and despair that wouldn't let go of them. There were students whose dreams for the future had suddenly disintegrated. The job fell through. The grad school didn't accept them. The significant other found someone else. All made their way, their pilgrimage, to her doorstep. I remember as a kind of paradigm the student clutching the letter of rejection he just opened, tears rolling down his cheeks. His first question was, "Is Dr. Parkander at home now?" Not easy being a light bearer when you suffer with those who are in pain. And suffer she did. She refused easy fixes of platitudes for them or for herself. What she did was to welcome them into her home and her heart, show them by her presence that she was with them in their darkness. And for many, that presence suggested that the darkness doesn't always win. Now, she has gone home herself into the world of light, but she has left her light perpetual to shine on us. Thank you, Dorothy Parkander.
Just inside the front door of the Swenson Hall of Geosciences, up on what used to be called Zion Hill when the seminary was here, there is an extraordinary living map of the world that is electrified and thereby always in motion. The map shows the viewer what parts of the world currently enjoy daylight and what other countries are now shrouded in darkness. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here as we gather in the light of day, while the folks in Malaysia, say, are getting ready for bed. It's appropriate for morning prayer here in Rock Island or morning Eucharist, while Malaysians would now be gathering for Vespers, evening prayer, or Compline, prayer at the close of the day. The important thing to know is that in light or darkness, prayer is constantly being lifted. There is no part of any day or night when prayer isn't happening somewhere in our world. You've figured out by now that the two hymns we sing this morning are first a morning hymn, then an evening hymn. They are all metaphor, of course, appropriate at a gathering to honor Dorothy, who was perhaps most comfortable in the realm of metaphor. The day you gave us, Lord, has ended, or we may say, the life you gave us, Lord, has ended. That's true for Dorothy now, not yet for us. But what an encouraging word at a time of death, the image of the earth turning on its axis to mark the course of a 24-hour day, to mark the course of our lives unto death. In the words of the hymn, the day you gave us, Lord, has ended. The darkness falls at your behest. To you our morning hymns ascended. Your praise shall hallow now our rest. Rest in peace, dear Dorothy. Rest in God's peace. Please stand as you are able and sing. To be true to Dorothy Parkander as we go our way today, we would do well to pack an apple with us. Growing up during the Depression as a PK, preacher's kid, on the south side of Chicago, her father and mother would pack a simple lunch for those who stopped at the kitchen door to the parsonage in need of a meal. Said Dorothy, "My mother insisted on an apple in every sack, always, always an apple." Because, her mother said, when you slice an apple on its horizontal axis, there's a star embedded inside. It's a sign of hope, a sign of joy, So take an apple with you today. Live in hope. Spread joy. Smile broadly. Amen.